The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and good morning to those who are joining us on this webinar. My name is Sandra Masters, and I'm so excited to have Joe Meyer here from Nationwide, who is presenting a session on learning through story-based podcast. And for those of you who joined us a few minutes early, I just want to go through a couple of announcements here. So I am sharing my screen here. Just want to make sure that we're sharing the screen okay. Hold on just a second. And we'll share it clean. How about that? All right, super excited. This month, we've got a great program for you coming up, but also next month on March 16th, join us for Designing Sales Training for the New Sales Economy with Amy Franco at Impact Instruction. So there's some major trends that are creating chaos in the insurance industry, and it's affecting our sales teams. So she's going to come share with us the 5 new skill sets your sales training needs to be successful, along with some strategies to build these skills into your design efforts. So hopefully you can join us next month as well, March 16th. And it's time to register. If you have not registered for the site conference yet in Spokane, Washington, June 24th through the 26th, in fact, raise your hand if you're planning on going to the site conference in Spokane, Washington. Anyone on the line? All right, great. Good to have you here. Hope to see you and meet you in Spokane, Washington. Thanks, Michelle and Rodolfo. Looking forward to it. All right. So for those who are brand new to site, maybe you're a guest and thinking about membership, or maybe you're a returning member, we don't assume that you know how to use the GoToWebinar tool, and we try to make these sessions interactive. So I'll show you real quickly how you can communicate with us, because we want this to be a conversation and we want to make sure all of your questions are answered. So if you're using a PC, you should see a control panel on the right with a little orange arrow that opens and closes the control panel. And I usually tell participants to uncheck the auto hide control panel under the view menu at the top, and then this area will stay open. And it's a place where you can adjust your audio. If you're joining via the internet, sometimes the audio can be a little delayed depending on what kind of wireless connection you have. If you're hardwired and have a good internet speed, then it's much better. But if you do have to switch to the telephone, it's easy to do, and just dial the phone number, access code, and PIN there under the audio panel. But it looks like most of you are using mic and speakers, and that's fine too. So if you do want to be unmuted during the session and you're using the phone, you would have to enter the audio PIN in your control panel. But we want you right now, go ahead and enter into the question box, where are you calling in from? And what's the weather like there today? And what kind of work do you do? Share anything you'd like to share. I want you to practice using the question box, because this is what we're going to use for you to enter your questions and comments. And we might do some informal polling too. So welcome, Yolanda from Greenville, South Carolina. Anyone else want to introduce themselves? Yay! Mary Gale from Ogden. Welcome. Paula from Chicago, 32 degrees. Ellen is in Illinois as well, and it's cold with snow. Welcome, Dawn. Heather. Dawn's in Columbus. Heather's in Sioux Falls. So please do keep on introducing yourself. And I just also want you to know where the raise hand button is on the control panel, and we might do a quick poll there as well. And right now, if you have not clicked on the link that was in the pre-event email, you can download the handouts, and these electronic magazines that Joe Meyer put together with his co-presenter are amazing. I am so looking forward to checking out some of the recommendations they make for podcasts to listen to, and each of those electronic magazines is just jam-packed full of tips on not only the equipment, but all importantly about storytelling techniques as well. So download the handouts from the handouts section. All right. So if you're new here, welcome. We want you to consider ways to get involved in Site, whether it's by joining Site as a member, or if you're already a member, finding a way to grow more with Site by getting involved. So we have unlimited benefits of membership, as you can see on the screen, and we'd love for you to get connected today. Site's a great place to network with people in a similar role as yours, and professional networking has a way of becoming a great tool when you least expect it. So the relationships you sow today may yield success in the future. Visit our website. It's insurancetrainers.org for membership information, and the listing of the board members are there, and we just invite you to get involved with Site. All right, so having said that, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Joe Meyer, who's got lots of treats for you today and good tips and tricks. So welcome to Site, Joe.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I want to thank Sandra for setting everything up today. I'm going to be going through a slide deck here, and we'll have some audio files that we'll listen to. There will be a really brief video as well, and I'll ask for some participation as well. And I do really want to emphasize, just like Sandra had mentioned, those two handouts that I put together. Those electronic magazines, we kind of call them. I initially designed them for my presentations at DevLearn, but they do apply to what we're talking about here. They do have a lot of the stuff that is actually in the slide deck. So I spoke with Sandra before. I was the kind of person who really didn't benefit from furiously writing notes in a classroom or a webinar or a seminar or anything like that. I like to pay attention and then afterwards kind of let it soak in. So if you're somebody like me, don't worry about having to write everything down on these slide decks. I'd be more than welcome if we have a resource to actually put the slide deck up. We can do that. But again, those electronic magazines actually go a little bit further in depth as well. So those are really nice to have. One of them goes more into storytelling, and one of them is going to be a little bit more about what we're going to talk about today. I've got on the slide deck, learning through story-based podcasts. So we're really going to focus on getting started with everything. How do you jump into this topic? Really, how do you get your business from nothing, absolute zero in podcasting to actually putting it in a curriculum, being able to put something together and hitting 60 basically from there. And I put transmissions from the edge. You'll see that the slide deck's pretty themed. I like to do that. It's like a graphic designer in me, and plus I was pretty excited about the Falcon Heavy launch recently. But overall, I like the idea of podcasts because it's really an old medium. If you think about it, they're radio shows that have come back in a different format and are really appealing to people now because of that on-demand nature. So as we go through this is kind of what we're going to look at. So as far as these sections, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sandra.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm kind of curious to know if there's anyone doing podcasting right now. How about I launch a poll?
Yeah, I'm very curious as well to see how many of you have, successfully gone from start to finish and actually launching it to learners, or if you've just, at home, put something together. Because again, a lot of this information that will be going in here might be a little rudimentary, some of it might not be, but as we go through here, I'm more than happy to take questions. We'll have a little section at the end. I'll take questions as well, and you're always more than welcome to message me afterwards as well if you think of something.
All right, we always try to get to 90% participation. We're at 88%, so last chance to weigh in. Have you ever created a podcast?
One last push.
All right, that's great. All right, so I'll close and share the results, and it looks like only 10% of our audience.
Great. Okay, no,
Yeah.
that's excellent. That's why I'm here, right?
Right. We want to get you started. And I'm just curious,
Yeah.
raise your hand if you're listening to podcasts. How many are listening to podcasts? Raise your hand if you're listening to podcasts. Many, many more. At least half of our audience are listening to podcasts. So that's great. Good,
Okay,
good. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it starts, and that's where I started with this. So just to kind of give some background, one of my fellow colleagues and I very big podcast fans, and we would retain all this information from listening to this, and it could be just the most like inane facts or something goofy, but it stuck with us. So we decided that it'd be a pretty neat vehicle to use for learning. It would be different. We would see a lot of different benefits. I'll kind of go over that here as well. But just as a heads up, in this session, we're going to be talking a little bit behind selling it initially to your business group or whomever your learners are. We'll be talking about some basic hardware, software. I'll be touching very briefly on storytelling and really what you need to look for as you're going through that. Again, there's one of those electronic magazines goes a heck of a lot more in depth into that if you're very curious about that. Afterwards, I'll give some tips and tricks. And lastly, we'll quickly look at a case study that we put together over here at Nationwide. All right. So to go ahead and start, we'll get into a tiny bit of the science of selling. Now, there are a ton of studies right now that are connecting retention rates with actual podcasting generally, and I'm sure a lot of you know that you can find really great figures on storytelling and retention rates, how much actually tying the concept in with a story will help your learners retain further on out from the learning event. A lot of those figures and a lot of the studies can be kind of extrapolated and set to podcasting as well, because you're essentially telling a story. Whether you actually are just interviewing somebody and running through that, you can put a narrative thread through that, or you're writing a fictional story. It all kind of sets that in there, and it really helps with retention. So some really quick figures we'll run through here just to see, I know that a lot of you have listened, haven't actually created a podcast. That's excellent. You are in the majority as it's going through here as far as electronic consumers, I guess. 112 million Americans listen to a podcast. That was way up. 11% doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a huge jump for media like this from 2016 to 2017. 67 million Americans listen to podcasts monthly. Again, a 14% bump, which is huge. And just to kind of put this into perspective, and I think this is great, 24% of Americans who are 12 and older listen to a podcast at least once every month. 21% of Americans are Catholic. So we have more podcast listeners in America than we have Catholics, actually, which is it's astonishing figure to me. 42 million Americans listen to podcasts weekly, which is crazy. It's a repeat, basically, which you don't see a heck of a lot. That's 15% of the total U.S. population. Only 3% of us now actually go to the movies every week. So more people are listening to podcasts than are actually going to theaters. So it's really, really crazy. And the next bullet point really kind of quells the idea that it might just be something for, Gen Y. We've heard before. That was a concern that we heard before. Now, the largest percentage of listeners are from 25 to 54 years old. So that is a really big age group, and it just shows the overall appeal of these stories and podcasting as a medium. Podcast fans listen to 5 shows per week, and they subscribe to an average of 6 podcasts. So really, they're looking forward to it, is what that figure shows. So that's something to say, people are ready for this medium. I know that it's difficult to jump into a new medium when you're presenting it as a learning event, and there is a lot of concern usually with how it'll be received. But just know, if you're starting in this, people are really into it. People are used to it. Like I said before, it's essentially a radio show in a different format. So it's not really that entirely new. So in terms of learning then, as you're pushing into that and you want to talk to your business unit or your boss or whomever about actually going through and making these, why would you want to do that? So obviously, like I mentioned before, it's on-demand material. It can be consumed anywhere at any time, and that's fantastic. That was one of ours here at Nationwide, and I worked with claims adjusters specifically. They have a lot of what we call windshield time, a lot of dead time where they're driving, from claim site to claim site, and they might be listening to the radio, that sort of thing. They're on the clock, but they really can't participate in stuff there. And that's unfortunately kind of handicapping them to a point in their learning, whereas other people who are in the office can run through stuff. So that is a really, really excellent point with podcasting. It lessens reliance on individual instructors, and that's just to say, again, it goes to the on-demand point, that they can get into it anytime. You don't have to have an instructor. You don't have to have them run through this material at a very specific time. They can get into it anytime. It is a little bit more intimate because you yourself are listening to it, unless you have somebody else in the car. Heck, they're really MP3s or MP4s when you break it down. So you can put it just about anywhere. You can put it in the classroom. You can embed it in a website, like we talked about. You can put it in your LMS. There are ways to kind of get figures, tracking figures, things like that, SCORM information from them. They're easy to archive. It is really engaging. It's cheap as heck. And that's a huge push that I want to make in this as well, that it is super cheap to put these together. And we'll be going over some hardware and software examples. A lot of it's free. You might already have a lot of the hardware already. If you're making CBTs, chances are you're not going to need to buy anything to make these. They are pretty easy to create as well. Once you get the hang of it, you'll be running around in no time. All right, so speaking of all those costs, let's go through some basic hardware. Now again, some of this might be a little superfluous. You might not need every little bit of equipment that I have here, but just here are some examples of some things that might be neat to have. Starting off with the microphones. I love using condenser microphones. So on the lower left-hand side, they're a little bit warmer. They're greater for studio use. So if you're recording voiceovers or anything like that, or you're trying to get a studio sound, condenser microphones are excellent. I have one at home I bought for, I want to say maybe $80. It is a Marshall. It's great quality. As of the past, I want to say 5 years or so, the cost of these have really gone down. You can get really, really nice mics. You can even get them as USB mics, so it's even easier.
Have you heard of the Blue Snowball, and what do you think of that one?
I have. I've used it before. I think it's great. I mean, it's a plug and play, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a heck of a lot of problem with that. The actual microphone, the way that the snowballs do pick up, I might be a little bit more of a fan of the condensers, specific condensers like that. They do, in my eyes, kind of perform a little bit richer than the snowballs. But heck, the Blue microphones are excellent, anyone that you get, and you really can't go wrong with them. So I don't want to steer you away from that if that's something that you have. Heck, if it sounds great and you're using it already, keep using it. Why not? Dynamic microphones you might not need. They're built a little bit heavier. The construction is a little bit more, or I should say, a little less susceptible to wear and tear. So if you're going to take something out and you have the ability to hook this up into your computer or anything like that, those are great for some field recordings. Speaking of which, that guy in the upper right-hand side, the field recorder, they're making these now really cheaply. These are great for getting what I call B-roll or the background noise, things like that that really envelope people in your podcast or your audio recording in general. You don't even have to have something like that Zoom or any other product like that. You might already have one in your pocket right now as you're sitting down. I've got an iPhone. It works perfectly for this sort of thing. Hit record, set it up, put the file in your computer. You've got it. You've got a little mini field recorder, right? Sound absorber. I can't push this enough. You can build these. You can buy these cheaply off Amazon. You have to have something behind your microphone, and this works great for condenser microphones or your microphone that you're using at your cubicle or in your studio or wherever you are, because you really want to deaden the sound in a studio. I hear a lot of voiceovers and CBTs or audio files where I can tell that you're basically recording it in a box, or somebody is recording it in a box, because sound waves bounce in a very particular way. So if you have parallel walls, it can just put that echo, and it sounds a little bit less professional. But if you have something to absorb the sound behind it, it helps a heck of a lot. It makes it sound, it really lets your mic shine. And then lastly, this might be one of the most important, get a good set of headphones. Even if they're, in-ears. Right now I have a set of $20 headphones, right? But they are pretty decent quality. I can really envelope them, and it gives you a better range of being able to listen to all the nuances in your recordings. So really pay attention to that. The Apple earbuds are good for some things. They're not really great for recording. So just as a heads up, that's a really, really important thing. All right, so now after hardware, we've got software. And I don't want to make this seem like this is an end-all be-all list, but here's some suggestions that I've got, a lot of programs that I've used, and these really run the gamut. Obviously, you see Avid, Pro Tools, that is the big upper echelon. It's excellent, huge learning curve, and it is quite a bit more expensive than the other options, but it's something, if you have the funds and you're able to take a look at it, excellent. Same with Logic, the picture of the Platinum record, it's Apple's more professional product. We here at Nationwide, the Claims Training Organization, like to use Audition. We actually run on the Adobe Creative Suite, so Audition is built into that. That is an excellent, excellent resource if you already have it. Not a lot of people I see use it, but if you can, excellent, go for that. GarageBand, if you're on a Mac, it's free. That's fantastic. The other thing that I actually use it for is putting together music. I have a MIDI controller that I might write some of the music for the podcast, but it does include loops, which you can actually really easily create custom music with that, and it's free, so why not, right? And Hindenburg is a program that's come out not too long ago. They offer a $99, I believe it's $99 or $95 version of their recording software, and they really cater to podcasters and home broadcasters. So that's really something neat to look at. I know that some professional podcasts actually use that program. So again, kind of a little bit of cheaper version of that. And you've got Audacity. Audacity is 100% free. So it's a fantastic place to start. If you're not sure if you want to continue podcasting or doing anything like that, heck, go ahead and look at that. Try it out. Download it. Get a good feel for, recording out in the field, recording in a studio. It's a great tool to really just play around with. Speaking of music, Audio Blocks I have up here as well. I believe that their subscription rates are $99 a year, but you can download an unlimited amount of totally license-free songs, sound effects, loops, anything like that. So that's a fantastic resource. We use it pretty often. I use it pretty often anyway, when I don't have the time to actually write my own music or put my own music in a podcast or a CBT or something like that. All right, so just continuing on, again, with storytelling, this is a huge, huge, huge piece of your actual podcast. I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I cannot emphasize enough how much time you should be spending on writing your podcast when you're going into this. It starts with it, it should end with it, and if you're looking at writing it and including a learning event, or you want your listener to get some sort of learning out of that, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I liken it, and this is kind of a weird analogy, but I liken it to baking a cake. I always say that I bake a cake for my wife once a year for her birthday. It's going to become a tradition. So I'm getting a little bit better here and there. But throughout that, I've learned that, when you're folding in the egg whites, right, you have to be careful not to overmix. So in storytelling, you have to think of it as your story and your learning event. Learning event being the egg whites. You want to fold them in but not over mix it. So, you know, it doesn't get convoluted. You still get your message through, right? But also so that it doesn't get a little too hokey. If you try to really push the learning event too straightforward, you're going to end up running in trouble with listeners being able to suspend disbelief, right? So really pay attention to that. I can't, emphasize enough reading through it again and again, making sure that it sounds fine. Read it aloud. Hand it to somebody who is not in insurance like us. Have them read through it. Does it actually capture their attention? Excellent. Does it sound like a real person talking? Excellent. If not, go back to the storyboard. So that's, kind of the gist, I guess, or the basis of writing stories for podcasting. And again, the other handout that I have there goes a little bit more so into the structures that popular podcasts actually use. I can't say enough things about actually just sitting down and listening to podcasts. Your favorite podcast or your favorite podcasts, sit down, listen to them, pay attention to how they're actually piecing the story together, how they're getting you to sit for 20 minutes to 2 hours. How are they actually doing this? You can gain a lot from that. So as far as the actual story, I like this quote. This was from a few years ago in The Atlantic. It was talking about how Serial really, really came to be so prominent, especially that first season. It says that our brain is trying to save resources and energy. We only want to give attention to something when it matters. So this is, again, this goes to me to not over mixing that cake. You can put tons of fluff in your story or your, the basis that you are writing this podcast for. You just have to make it interesting, Put those little learning events in there. They'll sit in, but you really, really have to make it interesting. If you do, people will pay attention to it. They'll sit for an hour, for 20 minutes, which is very unusual, as everybody knows, in e-learning. So when you're writing, or when I'm writing, I have 4 questions that I ask myself. Now, I kind of co-opted some of this from the head of Gimlet Media, which is a podcasting company which produces some of my favorite podcasts, like Reply All, Startup, some really neat ones. But Alex Bloomberg is a gentleman, and he had a couple of questions. Like I said, I co-opted these and kind of moved them through here. But I always ask myself these 4 questions when I'm writing to make sure that I'm not lying to myself as I'm going through it. So the first question I ask myself is, or that I really look to, is listen to your curiosity, or statement rather. So is this subject piquing my curiosity as I'm writing, right? Do I want to keep writing to get to the end? Not just finish it, but really like, oh yeah, I really want to, develop this, or I really want to get to this part. If a subject, piques your curiosity, chances are it's going to pique the listener's curiosity as well, or someone else's. So really pay attention to that. If it's something neat, even a little point within your story that you're writing, go ahead and dive into it for a little bit, even if it turns out to be a red herring, meaning just a little sidebar or something that isn't necessarily the end-all be-all in your learning event. But if it's just a little something, go ahead and dive into it. People will follow you in there as long as it's really neat. Secondly, listen to your boredom. So this is something else really easy that I like to point out. If you were writing a story, or you're writing a script and you're bored writing it and you just want to get the heck through it, you want to get to the end, so you hit your page mark or whatever, you're done, right? If it's boring to you, imagine listening back to it, being somebody walking out of the cold and listening to it. It's not going to be great. So if you're bored of writing it, start over again, or go back and retool it so that you do find something that you're really excited about within that topic. Thirdly, listen to your confusion. And this is huge, I think, for us, especially in the insurance world, because we do have a lot of a technical aspect to our jobs, right? And to the material that we are training. Listeners, if you get into your story and, you know, it starts to kind of feel like a math equation, right? Okay, so A happened because of B, but then B goes over to D, but you got to look at D back over to A, and it's going to get too confusing, and they're not going to really follow. And as soon as you hit that, they're going to become disengaged. They're not going to listen anymore, and then again, your learning event isn't really going to have any impact. So that's going to cause you a lot of trouble. So really pay attention if you're writing and you're having to keep looking back at what you wrote before and going. That's a pretty good indicator that you're going to need to retool some stuff. And the last one, and I love this one, ask the one stupid question. So again, this is something I like to think of when you listen to a podcast or a story or watch a movie or any story in general. Usually you can boil the story down to one question that you want to answer. This is the reason that you keep listening. This is the reason that you keep watching. This is the reason that you keep reading, right? So if you don't have that, if it becomes a little too convoluted, chances are you're going back to number 3 on here, right? So to those podcast listeners that we were polling earlier, I'm sure many of you have listened to Serial, right? The one stupid question in Serial is, did he do it? Did Anand murder his girlfriend, right? For those of you who haven't listened, it just surrounds a guy who's in prison, and they're trying to figure out if he actually did it or not. So that's the one stupid question. And that goes back to when you're going through this, the one stupid question doesn't need to actually be the learning event. You know, don't make your one stupid question, did they learn what I wanted them to? That's not what we're talking about here. And we'll see later on, I'll show an example of a podcast that we put together. It was a whodunit. So really the one stupid question was, who did it? Who created this crime? Or commit this crime? So that's a big point that I wanted to make as well, because we do have trouble, especially in the insurance industry, I feel, that we can deviate whatsoever from just the straightforward learning event. You can add this fluff in and make it even better that way. All right, so I'm going to go into some tips and tricks right now. I'm going to try and move through these. We've got some audio pieces, so if you do have headphones on, I want to make sure that, and we did test the levels and everything, so you'll be all set. But I've got 10 tips really here, and we'll kind of dive a little bit more into some of those later on. Start off, number 1, content is king. We already touched on this. Everything should start and end with your story. You can have the greatest microphones, you can have the greatest recording software, you can have the, you found the greatest amateur actors to be voice actors on your podcast. If the story isn't good and you haven't spent that much time on it and you just haphazardly put it together, it's going to fall flat. Again, people are going to be disengaged and you're going to run into trouble later on. So really, really pay attention to your story, to the actual content. Listen to podcasts. Mentioned it before. You can learn so much from just sitting down and actually paying attention to what the pros are doing, And I did, like Sandra mentioned, the 2 handouts. My colleague and I, Jeff, we put together some of our favorite podcasts, really, and some that have really great examples. We did little write-ups on each of them. So if you need somewhere to start, roll through some of those. Just see kind of what they're doing. And we talked a little bit again about why those are great, why they're actually doing that. The other magazine that I mentioned, the storytelling one, talks a little bit more about their story structure and why that actually works too. So just go out and listen. Voice recording is acting. This one's tough. because a lot of us have limited resources, and that includes human resources. So when we're looking to have somebody play a part, and again, this goes to video too, but specifically for podcasting and audio, you have to be really, really honest with yourself. So when you're casting for these parts, if somebody's having trouble reading, it's probably time to recast the part. It is so tough to keep things going and suspend that disbelief when you have somebody that's having difficulty reading, and not necessarily just actually reading the words, but reading it in a believable way. So I'm going to play a really quick clip here from a Gimlet Media podcast called Homecoming. This was a pretty big hit. It's neat. It's entirely fictional. They're pretty big names, and as far as acting is concerned in this, you'll hear Catherine Keener and David Schwimmer. But I wanted to point out that the extent the director went through when he recorded this, you'll hear a clip in a diner. He actually set up plates and forks and knives and set the microphones up above the actors to really get them into it. So is I don't know, gaudy or I don't know, as goofy as it seems, you really have to kind of get whoever you're recording in the mindset of this. So I'm going to go ahead and play this a little bit here.
Hi there. Hey. Welcome. So you wanted to sit in my section?
Yeah, I did. Your name is Heidi?
Yep, says it right here. Couple of specials to tell you about. Our soup is chicken rice, which is pretty good. And we have 2 entrees, pot roast.
Okay, Heidi, I'm going to stop you there because you had me at pot roast. That is exactly what I want. Can you get me one of those?
Yes, for sure. And to drink?
You guys have root beer?
Yeah, sure do.
Then I'll take one of those.
All right. We got this right out to you.
Thanks so much, Heidi.
Or a pot roast special. Hi. Yeah. What do you think? Someone's about.
All right, so I cut that one off a little bit there, but you can kind of see, just the structure that the director had set them up as helped them really get into it. And I've seen photos of them actually in production and stuff, so it's really neat. So it's something to think about. The acting is really part of this. Varying voices. This is hugely important to keep your listener engaged. If you have one person just talking on a podcast, and it does work from time to time, absolutely. Lore is an example of a podcast. The author, Aaron Mahnke, reads his short stories, basically, or the research that he's done, almost like a fireside chat, and it does work well. That is the exception, though. So if you're recording, it's going to be tough to keep up with everybody's interest if you're just somebody with a microphone just talking and reading through a story. So here's an example from Radiolab from NPR. They use a ton of bounce back, and they also use a host-producer kind of structure where the host and producer will talk to one another and the people that they're interviewing. So it really breaks things up. So this is a really neat example of what they do here.
Right, in space, but
when you hold it up close to your eye,
if you look closer in between the stripes, you can see sort of.
wow, you can see the lines. Wow.
You can see that the spaces are filled with faint little lines.
And that's where the piece of this story is just so fascinating.
Because in 1962, a paleontologist,
Professor John Weld,
was looking at some corals just like these.
he was just sitting there saying, okay, well, what can we figure out from coral shells? So what he did is he did something really simple. He says, well, golly gee,
Why don't I count the number of little lines between these things, just to see. So he starts counting, it's 100, 200 lines, 300, 310, 320. And every time he counted,
he got a number
around
360, 365.
Wait a second.
familiar number, no?
Doesn't take a whole lot of inference that, hey, maybe those individual rings represent, a daily pattern.
Yeah, so that's an example of being able to use a bunch of different voices. If you were to actually look at the script just all the way through, that whole piece that I just played would really just look like a regular paragraph. But when you see the transcript, so it breaks down the actors or the hosts and the individuals that they're speaking with, it's crazy. It's broken up so much and it looks so long, but it really wasn't that crazy if you were to listen to it. They're finishing each other's sentences. So that really, really helps a lot with keeping people in and keeping the attention coming back and coming back. All right, so for the next little tip here, trick, I should say, we're going to run through a really quick exercise. So I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to give everybody 15 seconds of absolute silence. So what I want you to do, if you are listening in a room, excellent. I will mute myself for 15 seconds. If you have your headphones on, do me a favor, just pop one of your earbuds out, or if you have over-the-ear headphones, put one of them back, and do me a favor, close your eyes, and I'm going to hit 15 seconds here. I just want you to listen around you. Don't have to talk to anybody, don't have to do whatever, just close your eyes and listen for me. So go ahead and start the 15 seconds now. All right, so I'm back. You can open your eyes, put your headphones back on. I know it's so odd, the sensory deprivation at that point, especially if you've had your headphones on. The reason that I had you all do that is the next tip I have is to be aware of your surroundings. When I was in college, I had a professor who told me, and for some reason this has always stuck with me, but he said, do you know what the best microphone is today? Best microphone out there. And all these people are listening on all these super expensive, whatever, we're in a studio. He says, no, it's a human brain. But the reason is because you filter out, your brain filters out so much noise that you don't even think about. And it's such a problem in audio recording because you may have white noise all around you. Heck, there are a lot of corporate buildings or larger buildings that will actually pipe white noise through all of their speakers and throughout the building, and you might not even notice it. But that's something that actually shows up. So when you're recording and it's just voices, it can sound a little dead, and that's part of the reason why. So if you are recording somewhere or you have a scene set up and you want to get it to really sound authentic and not too sterile or not too goofy, pay attention to things like that. I'm sure when you were sitting there and you were listening to your surroundings, a lot of you probably heard, if you're in an office, people behind you. You probably heard, a fan going. It sounds like a lot of you, there's probably a heater or the HVAC going off right now because it seems like a lot of people are in snow right now or pretty colder temperatures. Those things are very important to the scene. So pay attention to that because that really helps with the believability. And it also kind of ties in with number 6 here, sound effects. I can't stress enough that if you can, create your own sound effects. Record them with an iPhone, right? I can't tell you. So I did a series, a podcast series, and there were a lot of entering rooms, exiting rooms. So we had to get that sound of people entering and exiting. If you go in, use a stock sound effect, you get that really odd, like sound that's way too over the top, and it really snaps people out of suspending disbelief. But if you sit there, and again, I can't tell you how long I spent actually recording myself, and I look so weird doing it, but just opening and closing a door to get those right sounds, it's really powerful, and it really does keep people involved and really places them in the environment that you're portraying.
So, Joe, are those sound effects added during editing, or do you try to incorporate them as you're doing the original recording of the voice?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I like to actually include them afterwards. It's an old, and I worked in video for some time, and it's an old film trick where, you know, you want to get the cleanest vocal audio that you can. Now, sometimes you might want to just use, and it, you know, again, it depends on the scene that you're actually setting up. You might just hold the iPhone between yourself and someone that you're interviewing or talking to, right? But a lot of cases, I will record the voices separately to make sure that it's really audible, it's really clean, and maybe add those sound effects in afterwards. So I'll go out and record, and I've just set up, you know, like I said, a phone or a microphone in a room, press record. It seems like you're recording nothing, and it'll probably look crazy, but later you can just set that in the background. I mean, you know, I can't tell you how many times that I've needed office sound for a video or something, right? That's something that you can pretty easily get. And again, it just goes back to paying attention to that scene. What do you need for that? Really just kind of take it in and listen to what the scene needs. Right, really good question, really good question.
Thanks.
All right, so get out of the studio. This is another little piece from Radiolab that'll play here. This just goes back to using the outside audio as a scene setter or really as a character. So we'll listen to this fairly quickly here.
Did you have any idea what that meant?
No idea.
But we had that echoing. I had that echoing in my head.
All right. Do you want to switch backpacks since I gave you the heavy one?
So we flew to the Venice airport, took a bus to city center.
I was really fast.
Stepped off the bus, and you could smell the salt in the air from the Grand Canal, and it was kind of raining a little bit. It was around midnight.
We're kind of, you know, getting our bearings, grabbing our bags, and we look up, and across the parking lot, there's Alex.
Standing under a lamppost, just leaning against it with a cigarette.
Smoke kind of curling up into the light of the street lamp.
Short hair, dark. It was slicked back.
Do you think you were in a Fellini movie?
Honestly, I didn't know what to think. This person was legit under a lamp smoking.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to, obviously, they were going to Venice, or the two reporters were in there, but they were talking about their travels, and you got the sounds from them. One of them had a field recorder on them and just opened it up. That's fairly common for a lot of pretty popular podcasts that go out and do this sort of reporting or storytelling out in the field like this. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well, that you can use that to set the setting. Music rest. So our eighth tip here. This is going to sound odd, and I even got a pushback here and there from that, but it's going to add runtime to your podcast. When you are switching between an idea, or you make a really important idea, or something that goes toward your learning event that you really want to stick with your listener, a great way to transition is to give them some resting time, and you can do that by putting music. Just an absolute, like, nobody talking, just some music. Have that go longer than you actually think. I'm not talking about like a 2-second, 3-second, 5-second transition, but I mean, have it go for like 15, 20 seconds. It's gonna, when you're editing, you're gonna be like, this is weird. It's going on for too long. But when you listen back, what it really does is give your listener time to digest what they just went through. Because if you don't have those breaks, it's gonna be information overload. You're also not providing the reflection time for them to actually let that really important piece that you had set up there to settle in and to kind of move on. So we're going to play a podcast again from Gimlet Media called Mogul. This is about a record producer. So kind of here, this benefits from actually using the music that they're speaking about in the piece before, but you can kind of hear how they make a transition into a totally different scene right after that.
He got the idea to do 2 copies of the same record, so he could take the break section on Apache and crossfade right into the break section for Apache and keep it going and going and going from the left turntable to the right, back to the left, so that that 10-second breakdown could become this 10-minute beatdown. That was the invention of hip hop.
So remember, Chris and Dal were just kids when Kool Herc started spinning at park jams. But by the time they were teenagers, hip-hop music as we know it was starting to take shape. And now, rather than watching from their bedroom windows, the boys were right there in the mix.
So yeah, as you can kind of hear from that example, obviously, again, a benefit from the music that we're talking about playing in there. But you can see how Chris, the host, actually used that as a segue then to go into another part of the subject's life without making it too awkward and going into one thing or another. All right, so number 9, be honest with yourself. We've talked about this during this presentation a lot, but you really, this is so tough, but you really have to critique yourself. Have other people critique you as well. Now again, if your story falls flat, your learning event's going to fall flat. And it's going to be work that you did for nothing. So you really have to be honest with how great you're putting together, the piece actually is. If not, you don't have to scrap the whole thing. Go back and retool it. Sometimes it's just a little bit different of a segment. It's a little bit of a twist to a piece that you have in there to really change everything.
So Joe, when you're working with insurance content, do you find that building stories around actual claims or court cases is better than making up something that could happen? Like, hey, could this happen to me?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it depends on the material.
Mm-hmm.
You can do either or. I did, myself and another individual, we created a podcast in which we went over really specific litigation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we went back, found all these historical court cases that really went over these concepts that we were discussing. These were all really stranger than fiction, so it kind of piqued that curiosity piece that we were talking about earlier. So really just needed to talk about that. That was just straightforward, like, hey, look at this. Isn't this crazy? This is what we're talking about when we mention this subject or this content. So it really stuck there. But you can, and actually, it's going to go into this 10th point here, the greater good. You can go from really, really dry material and really write a huge story around that dry material and kind of go off the rails a little bit, but have it really go towards something.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I'll show that case study here. And when I say the greater good, I'm talking about curriculum, right? Your podcast doesn't have to stand alone as only a podcast. I'm going to send this out. You're going to listen to it. You're going to learn something. End of story. No, you can actually put so much ancillary material around that to really envelope in this world. And I would say if you're looking for another example of this, other than what I'm going to briefly show here, look at Serial. Their website, they have photographs of both seasons, I guess, maps, all of this different information that really kind of gets people into that world. And it does help really with the overall learning and helps things stick. So this case study we're going to show here, I unfortunately can't play you a portion of the podcast just because of the proprietary information on it, but I will show this little video here. We might encounter a little bit of skipping, but you guys will kind of be able to hear what's going on here. This is the Whodunit podcast I was talking a little bit earlier about, and this all surrounded commercial inland marine policy language. So before, we were just straightforward reading through this policy. That's how our participants were getting this information. my colleague and I had the idea to write a whole fictionalized, serialized podcast around this that kind of folded in some of this information. So I'm going to play this video pretty quickly. We'll kind of reconvene.
The commercial property inland marine class is a flipped classroom that teaches policy in a unique way. The online portion of the school consists of videos, discussion boards, readings, assessments, but is centered around a series of podcasts called Policy. The podcast follows a contractor and his adjuster through losses. There's a bit of detective work and mystery that comes into play. All of these materials are contained within our LMS via our community classroom, which students go through week by week for 4 weeks. The idea is that we're using alternative and entertaining means to teach behavior, particularly the way to read these inland marine policies. Then, in the classroom, they apply this behavior and perform a number of teachbacks.
Like your music.
All right. Oh, thanks. Again, that's audio blocks. This is a heads up. So if you were looking for something. But yeah, so that's an example. So as you can see here, we kind of co-opted the Serial logo, and that was purposeful. At the time, it was super, super popular. It was probably more popular than any other podcast, so we figured that we would have people more familiarized with that. So we modeled a lot of this after it. But you can see that we put it in an online classroom that we ended up flipping them. They learn these concepts. We made up deck pages for them to actually go through. They could print them out, hold on to them, police reports. We even went as far as falsifying like driver licenses, different stuff that they could really dig into. We had our instructors do a weekly recap of the prior week's episode and what they kind of came from that. So you can, use a podcast within a bigger curriculum and actually foster that type of learning from there. So at the end of all this, there's a big question we went through, but our participants, and we've had a number of podcasts after this, but they loved it. They really liked that, obviously, you're not just reading insurance policy, which is awful. You're actually listening to something and getting more entertainment value out of it as well. And they did do fairly better at actually retaining the information too, so that was excellent. So I only have a few minutes left, and I apologize, I probably ran through some of those slides. Again, I'd be more than happy to present the slide deck, but those 2 handouts go way more in depth, and I like to think it's a pretty good resource. But I'd like to open it up to any questions anybody might have.
Yeah, and you can raise your hand to be unmuted. Maybe you want to share something about podcasting that you have experience with. I know we have a few people that have experience podcasting, so we'll look for a raised hand. And also, if you feel more comfortable just using the question box, enter it there. So what are you looking forward to in podcasting in the future?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that just from a developer standpoint, I'm looking forward to creating different types of podcasts, and that kind of goes into the story structure that I mentioned before and that sort of thing, because there are a lot of different ways to put them together. If you go through iTunes, and just pick one, it's going to be way different than the other one. So I really love putting these together. It's a little bit outside of the box. As far as the future in general, heck, like I said, the equipment's becoming more and more cheap and becoming more and more to produce. So I think that you're going to see even more of an upsurge in really, really quality, cool, neat, and different podcasts because the medium's becoming more democratized.
So now, of all of the trade journals out there and research-oriented databases where you can look up court cases. Is there any resource that you found to be particularly useful in helping you develop your storylines?
Yeah, so we really, I'll say there are a couple different. For the court cases piece that we end up using, we used ERMI a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That helped a heck of a lot. And obviously these are all historical cases and they're public record, so you don't run into a heck of a lot of trouble with that or being able to use that. So your legal department will let out a sigh of relief if you do use something like ERMI.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, when I'm writing or when we're writing some of these, I like to actually go to the source. So you can use your SMEs. So we cater to claims adjusters. We actually went out and had like panel discussions with these adjusters. I write a piece, we'd sit in there, hey, how believable is this? Is this dumb? And then, if anybody knows claims adjusters are brutally honest. So we would just go through and redline some stuff or go back and revamp stuff. So, use the resources around you as well as some of that online stuff too, because that helps a heck of a lot.
Right. And one final question from Carlos. What do you think is the longest time frame for an educational podcast? Like, I guess maybe if you chunk it up, what would be a chunk?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, I like to stick to around the 20-minute mark, if possible, 15 to 20 minutes. But don't stifle yourself with that. Again, it just depends on the material. So when you're writing, try to pay attention to that. Are you trying to hit a page mark at a certain point? If you are, stop, right? Shorten it up a little bit. Heck, if it's 5 minutes, awesome. If they're able to kind of get that information, soak it in with that time frame, perfect. If it is something that is just grossly entertaining and you get it to 45 minutes, excellent. Excellent. You're not limited to the same I guess, bit as video. I think you need to be very careful. You need to be almost more careful of with that, unless it's a film or something like that. So really just pay attention to the material that you have. But if I had to give you any sort of a basis, like you said, I start with the 20-minute mark.
All right. Great. Well, Joe, thank you so much for sharing your talents and expertise with us today. I know I'm more motivated to go out and just start listening to the different podcasts, and really great share with the electronic magazines. Thank you for that. And I will ask you to send me a copy of the slide deck. We'll post it with the recording for our members at the site website. So we usually get the recording up within a week or so. And if you enjoyed the session, tell your associates about it and join site, and you'll have access to the recording and all of the digital material that you shared. So Joe, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And everybody attending, I appreciate it so much. If you have any further questions, Sandra did go ahead and send out my personal website. I've got a contact form on there. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. But again, thank you for attending. Thank you for Sandra for putting this on. It was excellent.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay. Happy Friday, everyone. Take care.